Hello, coders. Oop, hang on. Not sure if I'm live yet. Oh, there we go. Hello, coders. Hello. Now I'm live. Hello, coders. Welcome to episode 140 of the How to Code Well podcast. I am live, as I always am, Thursday evenings at 8 o'clock here on YouTube. And today we're going to be talking about code iteration and the time that each iteration of code can be reduced is critical to the success of web development projects. That's the topic of today's show, is code iteration time. Before we get into that, though, let's do what we usually do and dive into the changelog. This is where I talk about the various things that have happened on the How to Code World platform this week, or since the last time I spoke about it. So what we're doing is we are currently working through the PHP course, the new course that we're producing. It's about logging in and secure areas and all of that good stuff. It's PHP, raw PHP, no frameworks, no fancy JavaScript, bit of CSS, all good fun. We are almost, I can almost touch it, smell it, taste it, almost at the end of the documentation phase of this. And this phase documents each one of the lessons. There's going to be around 10 lessons in this course, and the documentation is done in essentially markdown files, README files. And we've nearly completed the first pass of the documentation. The second pass will be reviewing the whole thing, installing the whole project from scratch, but this time using a Ubuntu machine, Ubuntu virtual machine. And then the last pass of the documentation, if you will be done using a Windows machine, using a Windows virtual machine. So I've almost completed the documentation for the whole thing. Then the next stream, what I'm hoping to do, the next Tuesday's stream, I'm hoping to do it using Ubuntu, and then I'll probably need to have a couple of streams to fix that up, and then after that we'll do Windows. And then once I'm happy with everything, once I can install the project and get it running via the documentation on both Mac, Windows, and Linux, then I'll actually do the recording of the video. So we're getting there. We're getting there. Okay, another thing I want to say is that last week's show is now live. The last week's podcast I had to do offline because we were having issues with the internet here. So I did it offline, and that is on shopping carts and how difficult shopping carts are. And so that's available on the howtocodewell.fm website. Okay, so before we get into the topic of today's show, we're also going to just take a look at some questions that people have had on the YouTube channel here and other places. So first of all, there's two questions. First, Eric writes in and says that he writes in on the hack to check if PHP is working. That's a YouTube short that I did recently. And asks if the next video will be based on the PHP 8 match expression and when to use it. So I love the fact that he's put in the and when to use it part, because that's going to give me a big guidance as to when the next thing is going to be, or parts of that content should be. So I'm not going to promise that I'm going to get that done on the next YouTube short, but I will say that that's included in the schedule, the match expression. So don't worry, that will come up. But whether it will be the next one, who knows? Karel writes on the PHP Array Sum tutorial. So I did a tutorial on PHP Array Sum. Karel asks, how can we do the same thing but directly within the database in a database call? So the array sum sums the values of the PHP array and gives you a sum result of those things. So Karel asks how to do this in a database like MySQL. So there is a sum function in MySQL, and what it does is it takes an argument, which is the expression that it uses to sum up whatever you've passed it. So I've got a little example here that I'll just go through as to how you would use it on a sort of a day-to-day basis. So you can use it to find the sum of a field in several records by supplying the field name as the expression and then add the rest of the query as usual. So in your SQL query, you would say select sum as something, like, whatever you want to give it a name, from, and then the database table, and then where, and then your where clause. So the sum would probably go around in the select part of your query. So for example, to get the sum of a shopping cart or a shopping basket, you could do something like this. Let's say you had a table of order items with a foreign key to an order. Okay, so you've got one order has many order items. Okay, so in your order items, you have a link back to the order that each order item is associated with. Okay, so that's sorted out. You could get the sum of a specific order, the sum of all of the order items prices of a specific order, by saying select sum order item dot price, because price would be the field on the order item. So order item dot price from order items where order item dot order underscore ID is equal to whatever ID of the particular order you would get. That would return you a sum of all of the prices of the order items. Obviously, however, do change, I've got a little note here, obviously change the name of order in your query if you were to use this example, for instance, because order is a reserved word or reserved keyword in SQL, so change that. That's why I call things order summary or invoice or whatever. Thank you, Terry Murray, for joining. I appreciate that. What's happening next? I don't know. We're just gonna roll through it, I think. Today we're talking about code iteration, or we will be talking about code iteration. The time of the code iteration sort of feedback loops and why that is so critical. So the point, or the thing that really grabbed my attention, I should say, was this blog post, and it's written by Adam Berg. I'm going to put this in the show notes below when I finish this stream. And this caught my eye. Clickbaity title, but true nonetheless. The title of this blog post by Adam Berg was "Code shouldn't take all 3 lines of code shouldn't take all day." And I read that and I was like, pretty sure I wrote a little bit more than 3 lines of code today. Why did it take him all day? It turns out that Adam Berg worked for, was it Epic Games or Electronic Arts? Sorry, Electronic Arts. So he was a game developer. And he was writing all of these games. And he had to test, obviously, the code that he was writing. And it took ages for him to get any kind of feedback of the changes of code that he had created. Obviously, he had compile times that he had to take into account, but he also had to take into account the time in which it took to run what he calls as these test beds, these sort of automated sort of testing environments. And initially, through his post, initially, what it turns out is that he was working on the actual game, so you could actually just play the game and get to the point in the game in which your thing had to be tested, right? So that obviously took a long time in order to get the game to a particular state in which you can test. I mean, that would obviously take a long time. And then as he progressed, he did this thing where there was test beds, and those test beds were slightly more automated and only used the code that he was actually working on. It didn't have the whole entire suite involved. And then he goes on and says things about unit testing and how he started to work on packages where the unit tests would only test the specific code that he was worrying about, so it wasn't coupled to the whole entire suite. So as I was reading this, I noticed a trend where he was getting more and more precise as to what it was that he was doing, and the feedback loops were becoming more and more succinct to the environment in which he was working in. And obviously, with game development, you've got all sorts of crazy things that you have to deal with and worry about, like the whole, not even just playing the game, but the whole installation process, building it from scratch, loading all the assets up, getting to a specific level, having all sorts of, having all sorts of settings set up and all of that jazz. So the more of that you can automate and run in the background, or just have ready, or just install it quickly, then the quicker it's going to be for you to actually get to the point in which you want to test. So in the post, Adam talks about his time developing video games at Electronic Arts. He mentions that due to testing tools and requirements, it could take up to 3 days. It could take up to a day to write 3 lines of code. Get that right. So it could take up to a day to write 3 lines of code. This iteration time was greatly reduced when he used Testbeds. He mentions in his article that the Testbeds focused on particular areas of code, which meant the tooling was slimmed down. This allowed him to laser in to the code that was needed to be tested, and as a result made the code iteration far quicker. We're going to talk about why that's important in a second. He goes on to say in the post that he moved on to unit testing, which also made his life a lot easier. These tests were packaged up into contained sort of chunks of code, which was very specific to what his team needed and not the other teams. Again, this was a slimmed down portion of the game. He mentions that these test packages took less than a second to compile and run, which made him less distracted, and he could focus in on the task at hand. So this is game development, right? This is game development, but there's a lot of parallels to web development, a lot of parallels. So the whole destruction piece here is huge. So when I'm running, when I'm writing some code, and I usually have Slack running and emails running, you get distracted quite a lot. Lots of people will ask you questions and stuff, and whilst you're in the zone trying to write some code, it can get a little bit annoying. But, that's something that we just have to deal with. And you usually use the downtime as a means of responding to emails and queries and all of that stuff. And this downtime shouldn't, in my opinion, be time that is spent testing your code or setting up an environment, because that should be incredibly quickly. If you have to do something more than 3 times in a course of a very short period of time, say a day, then you really need to automate that, because you're going to make your life a lot easier going forward. So spinning up from nothing to a game in his regard, or to a website, an actual testing environment for a website, if that takes you more time than it does to actually write the test and write the fix, then you're doing something wrong. You want to be trying to create as less friction between you writing the code and you deploying the code. Right, so all the things in between, in terms of like debugging and testing it, running all sorts of different checks, you want to make sure that is nice and smooth. You don't want to hit any issues with your tools. So your tools need to be as nice and polished and as simple to use as possible. But if you're stuck with having to deal with setup, this isn't just testing. This is also if you've come into a project and you're new to a project and you have to install and build the project from scratch, then that should be a one-click process or a one-command process that is incredibly quick and if there's any error, you should be aware of those errors straight away. And also the setup should be specific to what you need at the time. Okay, so I'm aware of projects where you come into it and you've got to install every little thing, everything, even if you're not working on that thing, even if you don't care about that thing, even if it's not even in your team, you would have to install all the things. And that takes ages. I've worked in places where setup would take 30 minutes. That's all right. I've worked in places where it takes 3 days. I've worked in places where it takes nearly a week to get all sorts of things up and running, or longer, because you have to go through certain different chains of, approval or verification to download certain things or whatever. So the whole point of this is that your time in which you spend idling is not time well spent. And the thing is, the point that he made here about distractions really kind of made me think, because as soon as you get distracted, as soon as something happens, as soon as you get asked a question, and as soon as you think that you've got downtime, and that downtime is because you're staring at a loading bar, then the question often takes longer to answer than the actual process that you're working on. And then when you get back to the process, when you get back to the thing that you've built, you're like, what was I doing? What do I need to test? What do I need to do? Because you've taken yourself out of that loop. What I'm talking about here is context switching. You're switching context. You're juggling all sorts of balls at once. And if you're in the middle of, I need to fix this bug, and let's say, for instance, you're really deep into some really crazy nested loops or something that is just insane, and you're really burrowed down, and all your senses are just tuned into this particular line of code that you are testing, and then you have to run it on something that is going to take you half an hour to just get running in order for you just to get to that point and test it. And someone sends you a message on Slack, and you're like, okay, I'll quickly respond to this. Then you could be responding to a colleague that is looking at their code, which means now you've shifted your whole entire focus from what you were trying to achieve to answering a question. Now, you obviously have to answer questions when you're coding, sure. But what I'm trying to say here is that your setup time shouldn't be used as a sort of a distraction-free zone, if you will. And your toolings should be made as efficiently as possible. Any kind of little thing that trips you up should be removed. It's a barrier. It's a barrier, in my opinion, and it needs to be removed. Any kind of mishap, that needs to be removed. Because not only does it help you, but it will also help other developers coming on board and experiencing the same thing. README documents need to be updated. Anything that can slow yourself down needs to be reduced. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things that can't be reduced, but one of the things that I want to focus on is testing. One thing that I hear from people who haven't done any testing at all on projects is that it takes time. Not only does it take time to write the test, but also it takes time to run the test. And there is a solution to the time in which it takes to run the tests, and that is to only run the tests that you need. You don't have to run the whole suite. You don't have to run everything at once. See, I think what was happening, if I read between the lines with the Adam Berg article here, I think what was happening is, in his early days when he was an interim, he was running suites where it would run the whole thing. And that would take a long time, running the whole game. Whereas when he progressed into working for other teams, he started using these test beds, and he started working on unit testing where it was a specific thing that he was testing, and that setup was very quick because it was the code of the test code was only worrying about the thing that he was dealing with. He didn't have to worry about all the other bits and pieces, parts of the game. With web development, or just software development in general, you can get away with just testing what it is that you've focused on. In PHP Unit, for instance, there is a way of filtering out all of the other tests. So in PHP Unit, there's this annotation called groups, and there is an argument called -g. And if you do, if you come online, PHP Unit, so bin PHP Unit, -g, I believe it is, or at least that is in Codeception. I might have to just check in PHP Unit, in raw PHP Unit, but in Codeception, let's talk about Codeception. -g, you can actually pass in a keyword, some sort of string that you've set as an annotation on your test. Now, the way I do it is with my tests, I have around about 3 groups per test, and that may seem a little bit, much. But what I do is say, let's say I was testing something that was specific to the order process, so ordering an item of something, for instance. And I would say I may have 200 of these tests that focus on the order section. Fine, okay. Let's say so that would be the first group. So the group would be order. So if I was to run Codeception, run unit -g order, it would run all of those 200 tests. Let's say I've got 1,000 tests in total, and 200 of them were order tests. Well, I don't have to run the whole 1,000 suite just to check whether or not something was added correctly to the cart and the calculation was working. Because to be frank, I don't really care at this present second whether or not, I don't know, a button on the contact form works, because that's not what I'm worried about right now. I'm worried about adding a product to the basket and making sure that the total gets calculated correctly. So I don't need to run the test for anything else. I just need to run the test for that specific test case. Okay, so we have a group called order. Fine. Okay, let's now get a little bit more laser focused. Maybe I'm testing the add to order. Maybe I'm testing order items. So it's order and then order items. So I have another group and we call it order items. And maybe in that block of 200 tests, we have, say, 100 specifically for order items. So now I've narrowed down that even further. So I'm not testing the whole order. I'm not testing removing of products from the order. I'm not testing updating the order's quantity or order items quantity, or canceling the order or changing the shipping address of the order. I don't care about any of that, because all I'm caring about right now is adding an item to the order and checking whether or not the total is correct. So, okay, instead of using order, we're going to do order items. Fine. But still, 100 of those tests have already been are running, and there's a lot of those tests that I don't really care about right now. So let's go a little bit specific, and let's actually say group order -items -add to basket. That is my group that is specific to what the test is actually doing. So let's run that, and that'll run one test. Let's make sure that one test passes, and because I'm only testing one thing, it's going to be lightning quick. The feedback loop is going to be instant. Boom. So we run that, and we've got a failure. Okay, so we fix the failure, we run it again, it works. Brilliant. Okay, so now we want to check the order items. Let's run order -items. So that's going to run our 100 order item tests. It's not going to run the whole 1,000 tests of the suite of 1,000 tests. It's just going to test the order -items group. Okay, so 100 of those tests now get ran. We have a problem. Fine, we need to fix it. Okay, let's now go back to running the order items -add to basket group. Make sure that still works. Yes, it does. Okay, then I'll run the order items group. Yes, that works. Okay, great. Let's now run all the order ones. Yes, that's all worked. Okay, now we can run the whole suite. And now I'm going to make a cup of tea because it's going to take ages. But do you see what I mean? What you've done is you've instead of looking sort of looking over it and getting a higher view and saying, all right, I'm going to test all the things just because of this one little change. I'm going to test this one little change first, and then I'm going to test all the things that are perhaps associated to that, and then I'm going to test everything else. just to be sure. And the likelihood that the contact button breaking because you've changed the order item add to basket functionality is very, very unlikely. But let's just test it anyway. So that's what I'm trying to say is you got to think differently as to how you run these tests, because you want to be getting the quickest feedback loop possible. And if you can group by or filter your tests, I think with PHP Unit you filter them, whereas Codeception you group them or something. If you can do that and you can get more precise as to what the feedback loop is actually going to give you, then you're going to become more efficient, and therefore you're going to be writing more code because it's going to flow quicker. There's less gaps in your code. Therefore, when you actually get distracted by some Slack message or by an email, you actually have time to deal with it. You're not dealing with anything else because perhaps you've got to the point where you've tested all of the things, and now you're just going to test the whole suite just in case, and then you get distracted. Okay, well that's far better than getting distracted on the reverse. So let's say I've just changed this order items thing, right, and this add to basket thing. But instead of just testing that one thing, I now have to test the whole thing because that's the only way I can do it. So I test the whole suite, the whole gamut of stuff, and then I get distracted. And I'm just looking at this thing, and it's like, test 1 of 5,000 being test, 100 of 5,000. It hasn't even got to my test yet, and I've got distracted. Now I've answered this thing, and now it's got to my issue, and now I've got to fix the thing, and I'm halfway through a conversation with someone else. What I want to do is actually get to that specific test first and then deal with everything else afterwards. So I guess it's just a different way of approaching testing, and it's a different way of thinking about how am I going to actually get this feedback. Another thing that I do is if I'm having to eyeball things, which I do quite a lot, let's eyeball whether or not this works. So I'm actually clicking through the site, is I would have a terminal window running with the log stuff coming out. So, or even I would have the debugger window running, the web development toolbar, so I can see the console logs running. So I have as much information as I possibly can have open when I'm doing the thing that I'm eyeballing. Otherwise, I'm going to end up having to redo it again and again and again. And in some cases, you have to get an account to a specific state in order for you to try and replicate this thing. So in order to have, information is power. Get as much information as you can right away up front. So have your error logs tailing, so you can follow the logs. Use tail -f if you're in the Linux world. So tail -f of the logs. This means that every request you're going to get the log entry. Look out for things like 500 errors, 400 errors, that kind of stuff. If you've got any other kind of monitoring going on, make sure that that's available to you quickly. And you essentially just want to get as much information on the first pass as possible, because then you can say, okay, yeah, actually that happened through an AJAX request, and I can see that there was a console issue with this AJAX request because I can see it. It's come back with a 500 error, but oh no, I didn't actually look at the logs. So now I need to do the whole request again and tail the logs as I do it. Well, if I tailed the logs in the first place and I had the web development toolbar running, I could see that it's hitting a 500 error. It came back with a 500 error, and I can actually see it in the Apache error logs. So there we go. I don't have to run this request for a second time just because I've noticed that it's a 500 error in the web development console. So it's just having these sort of these key, these key information things available to you as quickly as possible. Reduce the amount of time that you have to repeat yourself in order to replicate the issue. If you can get the issue straight away, then that will make you more efficient. That will make you a better programmer going forward, because time is incredibly valuable. And if you can get to the issue faster than some other developer, then you will be seen as more of a worthy purchase from a HR point of view, let's say. Anyway, thank you ever so much for listening. I hope that kind of made a little bit of sense, and I didn't go too off on too much of a tangent there, but I do think that this is really important. So scaling down the feedback, the time in which it takes you to iterate over code, and focusing on the time in which it takes to actually get a testing environment up and running, and getting into the nitty-gritty part of whatever it is that you're doing. Yes, there is a place for integration tests. There definitely is a place for integration tests, sure. And I do think that when you do a deployment, that there should be some level of integration testing that is automated, and they do take a long time. Fine. But when you're actually developing, when you're actually writing the code, fixing the bugs, there is no need, well, I shouldn't say that. There is more need for a unit test than there is for an integration test straight away. Because you should focus on the unit of work, the thing that is broken, and that is, the unit of work that you're trying to break. And once you have that, you should just test that initially, and then you can start layering on the other tests that could be associated with that functionality that you've just played with. And, the more you test, obviously, the more confidence you gain. But what I'm trying to say here is you need to flip it on its head, and instead of testing everything at once, you should be testing the smallest amount first and then go out the way. Otherwise, you could be testing all sorts of rubbish that is completely irrelevant to the thing that you're actually working on, and that is going to take so long to do. Yes, it's cool to see the terminal output, yes, this tick, 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 tick. Of course it's tick, 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 tick coming out your terminal window. But none of those tests are kind of relevant right now. Anyway, thank you ever so much. Happy coding, everyone. And I'll see you again next week for the final podcast of 2021. Take care.